I have this thing. I give everything nicknames. Ever since Jesus gave me the nickname Peter, I love nicknames. It's my thing, right? And so this whole week, I've been giving things nicknames all the days of the week. Like this past Sunday, that was Super Palm Branch Sunday. I've got to shorten that, but I got Miraculous Monday, Terrific Tuesday, Wild Wednesday, Thunderous Thursday. And because this week has been so amazing, I went ahead earlier on this week and I named Friday. I'm calling it Good Friday because it has to be good, am I right? I'm telling you, it's been so amazing. So back to Thunderous Thursday, we had the Passover meal. So many things happened that night. Then after the meal, Jesus calls us out of the garden, right? And he wants us all to pray. He asked me, James, and John to come a little bit further. We carb loaded. We kept falling asleep. But one time I woke up, right? And I'm looking yonder and I'm watching Jesus pray, and he is saying something like, what is it? If you can, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours. And then, I mean, it went fast and furious, right? Like all chaos breaks loose. Judas kisses Jesus on the cheek. All these guards come around to arrest Jesus. And I'm thinking to myself, someone has to do something, right? I volunteer as tribute. This will be my Sparta moment, right? I grab my sword. I'm going to be known as the guy that starts the revolution right here in the garden, except I'm known for the guy that just swiped right, and I cut off this guy's ear. I'm Vincent Van Gogh. I'm a fisherman, not a swordsman. But I'm telling you this right now, right in the middle of all of it, Jesus picks up the ear and puts it right back on the guy. I'm like, that is so cool. Do that again. He's like, now's not the time, Peter. And I'm like, cool, right? And then before you know it, they take Jesus to the high priest's house. And we all just kind of scattered. I think we didn't want to be recognized, Didn't want to be seen with them. So I find myself at this campfire, right? It's kind of late at night, and I'm just minding my own P's and Q's, right? And all of a sudden, this girl comes walking around the campfire, and she's looking at me, and she's like, you're with them. You're one of the disciples. You're one of the followers. And I'm telling you, every eye is on me. It is like Survivor Island, and I'm about to get voted out, right? And so I'm like, just quietly, just get up and go, I don't know what you're talking about, all right? I just don't know what you're talking about. It's not me, okay? And then here's what I decided to do, right? I'm gonna go up to the gates. I just wanna see if I can see Jesus, but I don't wanna be seen with Jesus. Does that make any sense? So I'm trying to go up to the gate, and sure enough, another girl recognizes me, and she's like, you're with them. You're with the man that claims to be the Son of God, aren't you? And why wouldn't she recognize me? So many people saw us this week. I'm just like, I don't know what you're talking about, all right? It wasn't me, all right? I think throughout the night, I just didn't want to be recognized. I was trying so hard, maybe just to be invisible, just to slink in the shadows, Just get through the night. Sure as the sun rises, someone recognizes me, ear incident, and that's even more bold than before, and they're like, You're with them, right? You're with them. You're one of the disciples. You're with the man that claims to be the Son of God. And I'm just so tired, right? I've just had the longest night. And I just go, no, I'm not. I don't know what you're talking about. Just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. And two things happen at that very moment. The first is I hear the most blood-curdling sound I ever did hear in my whole life, and it was that rooster. And the second is I'm looking right in the eyes of Jesus because he has those eyes, and he was not looking at me with judgment or shame. He was just looking at me with a whole lot of love. And Jesus, that night, they beat him. They tore his flesh. They mutilated him. They punched him. They kicked him. They mocked him. They just kept saying, hey, where's your heavenly Father now, huh? Who's going to get you out of this one? And everything in me just wanted to stand up and just say, stop it. You don't know what you're doing, all right? Leave him alone. That's my Lord. That's my King. That's my friend. Just leave him alone. I caught a glimpse of him. I mean, he was hardly even recognizable. That, early this morning, They took Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and from every side, I just keep, it's like this swirling wind. I just keep hearing these murmurs, these whispers, and it's like, crucify him, like the whole town, just crucify him. And I just want to cover my ears, but it just keeps getting louder and louder. Crucify him, crucify him. This would have been the moment, right, that the 12 of us banded together, 30 dozen, stand up for him. But we didn't. We all, I ran again. I nicknamed it Good Friday. This was supposed to be just a really good day. There's nothing good about it.
There was nothing good about it, was there? Not after Jesus and his disciples left that special meal in the upper room and headed out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knew what was coming, and so he went off alone to pray about that. And he asked his disciples to pray too, but they fell asleep on the job. And things went downhill from there. Judas shows up and betrays Jesus with a kiss. Jesus is arrested and put on trial. All his friends run away, every single one. Well, Peter came back, following at what he thought was a safe distance, but then he got a little too close to the action. And when confronted about his connection to Jesus, Peter ended up denying Jesus, not once, but 3 times, failing to live up to those earlier boasts of, everyone else will run away, but not me, Lord, not I. You know, that had to be really hard on Peter. I'm thinking the guilt and the shame and the regret, they're hard things to recover from. Is it even possible to recover after falling so far? More on that in a little bit. But first, let's look at what's going on with Jesus here. Because Jesus is now alone and rejected. Satan is sifting the disciples like wheat in a windstorm. They're nowhere to be found. Death and defeat are closing in on Jesus. The die is cast, and there seems to be no going back at this point. The powers of darkness are attacking God, and the powers of darkness seem to be winning. And maybe you wonder, well, if Jesus had the power to stop it, and he did, then why didn't he? Why didn't he? Why does Jesus just stand there and willingly accept what's going on every single step of the way? The short and the long answer is, Jesus did it for us. And that applies on several different levels. I mean, first consider the isolation and rejection. Isolation and rejection like Jesus is facing here, those are some of the painful results of that first sin in the Garden of Eden. And perhaps you've experienced some of that same pain yourself. Sometimes people who were in your corner aren't anymore. Sometimes your friends betray you. Sometimes your friends will end up stabbing you in the back. Sometimes friends will walk away from you or even run away from you. Sometimes friends will hang you out to dry in order to save face or to save their own skin. And that really hurts. And that's not the way God made things to be. God made us to support and care for each other. He told Adam in the garden, it's not good to be alone. But ever since Adam and Eve sinned, this kind of a painful rejection is also part of the brokenness that now exists in our fallen world. And Jesus willingly takes that part of the curse, that part of the brokenness onto himself here too. Because Jesus is thinking about us before he's thinking about himself, which is really important for us. Because when you're in that place, when you're feeling rejected and abandoned and alone, and you scream to yourself, nobody cares. No one knows how I feel. Jesus stands up and says, I do. I do. And that helps. It helps to know that Jesus knows what you're going through. It helps to know that Jesus is there to help you through it. It helps to know that not everybody rejects you, but that Jesus is there and Jesus is standing up for you. And it helps to know that Jesus is there to help you through that icky emotional moment. But that also is not all that's going on in this part of the story. See, this part of this particular week in the life of Jesus also lets you know that Jesus is there to help you through those icky spiritual things too. The times like Peter, when you have the chance to stand up and you end up letting Jesus down. Now, as you hear me say that, maybe first, in the first part of this story, you're looking at these mistakes that Peter and the other disciples make, and you're saying, well, it's not that hard to find yourself thinking, okay, they messed up, but surely not I, Lord. Surely not I. I mean, I know that Jesus didn't come to set up an earthly kingdom, so I wouldn't let my emotions get the best of me and strike out like some soldier defending his turf. Not I, Lord. Certainly not I. But then I think about the times I rant on social about something, or I turn the gospel into something political, or I try to defend God by lashing out at others, and guilty, just like the disciples. Well, at least I wouldn't run away from Jesus like the other disciples did right after he was arrested. Certainly not I, Lord. Certainly not I. I am here for you. I am in it. But then I notice that my worship time in church is becoming more sporadic as other things are competing for my time and my attention. And my personal Bible study and prayer time are becoming a lot more haphazard. And again, guilty, just like the disciples. Okay, well, I make mistakes. Everybody does. Peter, James, and John made their share. So did the other disciples. But Peter, James, and John are still fairly popular names. Nobody names their child Judas anymore. So certainly I'd never betray Jesus. I'd never pretend to love him and do something totally different. Not I, Lord. Certainly not I. But then sometimes I find myself acting as if I'm doing fine all by myself. And that the good things I do, well, they get me close enough to the mark to make up for my mistakes. And if that's sort of what I'm thinking or feeling, doesn't that say it wasn't really necessary for Jesus to go to the cross? Or what about when I claim to be his disciple, but then I willingly disobey his commands because I think I've got a better plan for my life, and maybe there's a part of my life that I'm not willing to put under his control? And maybe I say, well, Jesus, I love you. You're important to me. But do my words match up with my actions, with what I do? Or are my actions more like Judas' kiss? And again, guilty, just like the disciples.
The older we get, the more we look back on our lives and wish we would have done things differently. Our choices not only haunt us, but at times they can travel with us. Words like shame and guilt attach themselves to the stories our lives are telling. Peter, a follower of Christ, knew this all too well. He was the disciple who dropped everything to follow Jesus, was an eyewitness to miracles that we only dream of experiencing, and was the only disciple to step out of the boat and walk on water, even if only for a few seconds. But then things get messy. The pressure of the crowd causes Peter to experience his own version of shame and guilt. And if we're honest, our lives might just be closer to Peter's life than we care to admit. You're invited into a moment of reset and discovery, because the events around the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus are the absolute answer to every longing heart. So may God give us eyes to see.
So how do you deal with the burden of the guilt of letting Jesus down and letting yourself down? I mean, it's a really heavy burden, isn't it? What's Peter feeling when he's out there crying in the courtyard after he heard the cry of the rooster? Is he scared? Sad? Ashamed? Is he guilty? Is he feeling sorry? Is he devastated? Like, how could I do that? How could I let Jesus down? Maybe, is it all of the above? I mean, the burden is big. It's more than we can carry. And the question is the same one I raised at the beginning. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that if you find yourself in a place like Peter was? Here's a hard truth. On our own, we can't. We can't. But Jesus knows that. And that's why Jesus came. Jesus came to defeat the darkness and to help us find our way out of our own darkness, not by self-help, but by leaning into his grace and his mercy and his love and finding forgiveness there. And there finding the fresh start that we need. And even here, in this part of the story, as the darkness seems to be closing in, we see hints of Jesus' grace and mercy and love coming through. So let's circle back again and look at what Luke wrote. Luke chapter 22, starting at verse 47.
While he was still speaking to the disciples, a crowd arrived. The man called Judas, one of the 12 apostles, was leading them. He came close to Jesus to kiss him. Jesus said to him, "Judas, do you intend to betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" The men who were with Jesus saw what was going to happen, so they asked him, "Lord, should we use our swords to fight?" One of the disciples cut off the right ear of the chief priest's servant, but Jesus said, "Stop, that's enough of this." Then he touched the servant's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, temple guards, and leaders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal? I was with you in the temple courtyard every day, and you didn't try to arrest me. But this is your time, when darkness rules." So they arrested Jesus and led him away to the chief priest's house. Some men had lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard. As they sat together, Peter sat among them. A female servant saw him as he sat facing the glow of the fire. She stared at him and said, "This man was with Jesus." But Peter denied it by saying, "I don't know him, woman." A little later, someone else saw Peter and said, "You're one of them." But Peter said, "Not me." About an hour later, another person insisted, "It's obvious that this man was with him. He's a Galilean." But Peter said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Just then, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. Then the Lord turned and looked directly at Peter. Peter remembered what the Lord had said. "Before a rooster crows today, you will say 3 times that you don't know me." Then Peter went outside and cried bitterly.
A few things jump out at me here as I hear that read again. First is the arrest. So you've got Peter, the fisherman, pulling out a sword like he's some super ninja warrior or something, and he ends up cutting off the ear of one of those who are surrounding Jesus. But that wasn't accuracy. I mean, like a warning shot, like, watch out. This is a flesh wound, but if you guys aren't careful, I'm going to get you, and then I'm going to get you, and you, and you, and you. No, it wasn't accuracy. It was incompetence. Peter was no swordsman. He's bold, he's rash, but he's not a trained fighter. Any damage that he caused was by accident. So what does Jesus do? Now you might think here, after somebody draws first blood, that Jesus is going to say, well, okay, now let's get in the fight. Or Peter might be wishing, or Jesus might be wishing of Peter, boy, I wish your accuracy was a little better there. But that's not what Jesus does. Luke writes, Jesus says, stop. That's enough of this. And then he heals the man's ear. Heals the man's ear, the man who was part of the arresting crowd. Heals a man who was not his friend, heals a man who was his enemy. And so, you know what? Just like he did earlier in the evening when he prayed, thy will be done, Jesus here again practices what he'd been preaching. And he gives his disciples one more opportunity to see his heart of compassion and mercy for all. Here's the quote from earlier in Jesus' ministry, Luke chapter 6, verse 27. Jesus taught his disciples, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And here that's exactly what Jesus is doing. Doing good to someone who came to arrest him. I mean, and the natural feeling is, well, he's got what's coming to him. But that's not what Jesus does. One more time, Jesus is letting his disciples get a glimpse of his heart of grace and mercy and compassion for all, even for the fallen, even for those going the wrong way or doing the wrong thing. And his disciples would need to know that, wouldn't they, if they were to be able to recover from their own failures that night. And I'm thinking, maybe later, after Peter heard the rooster crow, and that crow cut him to the heart and brought him face to face with his own guilt and shame, that maybe Peter remembered that earlier incident and Jesus healing the ear of his enemy and thinking, well, if Jesus can heal the guy's ear, then perhaps Jesus can heal my heart. And that's the second thing that jumps out at me here. The rooster crows, and Luke writes that Jesus turns and looks at Peter. But I don't think it's the look that you'd expect. I don't think it's a look there of accusation or condemnation or judgment. I think Peter's already doing that to himself, and Jesus knows that. Peter's fallen hard, and so he doesn't need to be kicked or squashed when he's down. He needs to know that there's a way back up. He needs to know that recovery and redemption are possible. And I believe that's what Peter saw in that look in Jesus' eyes. Grace and mercy and love and the offer of forgiveness. I mean, isn't that what you need to recover, to come back, to stand on your feet again after you've stumbled and fallen? Knowing that grace and mercy and forgiveness are there? I think that's why Jesus made sure to look at Peter, so Peter'd see that. And so seeing that Peter would also remember something Jesus had said earlier in that night to him. Jesus had told Peter, Peter, I'm praying for you. And Peter would remember that in seeing that look in Jesus' eyes, that Jesus had been praying for him, praying that his faith would not completely fail, praying that the guilt and the shame and the regret of what he'd done wouldn't pull him under, praying that Peter would know that he's forgiven and could start fresh, and that as he did, he'd strengthen the other disciples, praying that Peter would know that he's forgiven even after all he'd done and how badly he'd messed up, which, again, is the same thing we need to know after we've failed too, isn't it? to know we can be forgiven, to know we can start fresh, to know that recovery and redemption are possible. So I want you to try to do something with me for a moment maybe to drive that point home. How many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3 times, right? Well, let's do something to see visually that, to see what Jesus does to help us recover from our own mistakes and misjudgments. Peter's first denial hurt Jesus. So I want you to just, wherever you're sitting, unless you're driving, don't do this if you're driving, but if you're sitting somewhere, just take a moment to stand up. Stand up and just think of a time that you've hurt God. Well, Peter's second denial also hurt Jesus, didn't it? So now, put out your right arm and think of a time that you've hurt a friend. Well, Peter's third denial hurt Jesus too, didn't it? So now I want you to stick out your left arm, again, like you're being nailed to a cross, and think of a time you've hurt somebody in your family. Now look at the shape that you've made. You've made the shape of a cross. Now listen as I read from John chapter 3. And each time you hear the word son, I want you to cross your arm over your chest. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, in order that the world might be saved through him. Now look at your chest. What are you making there now? Well, you're making the sign for love. And that's what this week in the life of Jesus is all about. Jesus went to a cross to show his love and to give us his love and to let us know that grace and mercy and forgiveness are always available to us, and to help us realize that Jesus' forgiveness gets rid of the guilt and the shame and the regret, and it helps us start fresh. And thinking of that makes me think that maybe there was one more thing going on there in the look of Jesus here and throughout the night, actually. As the cross is only now hours away, I think that Jesus looks at all our faces and remembers, this is why I'm going to the cross. And so that night, in the upper room, Jesus looks around the table as his disciples are arguing about who's first and second, and nobody gets up to serve. And he looks at their faces and says to himself, this is why I'm going to the cross. And later he looks at Peter, James, and John sleeping in the garden when he asks them to watch and pray. And again looks at their faces and says, this is why I'm going to the cross. And here, as Peter's dealing with his guilt and shame and regret that he's denied Jesus 3 times after he said, Lord, not I, I'll be with you the whole way, holds Peter's face in his eyes and says, this is why I'm going to the cross. And future forwards looks at our own denials and mistakes and shame and regret and holds our faces in his eyes and says the same thing. This is why I'm going to the cross. I'm going to the cross for these people, so they can be forgiven, so they can get past the guilt and pain and regret, so they can start fresh, and so they can start to share my love with others, which is why Jesus gives darkness its moment here. And why Jesus lets all this happen to him. The betrayal, the arrest, the denial, the rigged trials, the cross, all of it. In this moment, it looks like darkness is winning, and that the light of the world is being slowly extinguished. But is it? Or is there a deeper plan? Jesus, the light of the world, taking all that darkness on himself, seemingly consumed by it, looking like he's destroyed by it, but in knowingly and willingly letting that darkness surround him, and then taking it on himself and carrying it to a cross, Jesus actually defeated the darkness and destroyed its power to have a stranglehold on us. And then Jesus lived to tell about it. Easter's coming, remember? Which means that Jesus is still there. Jesus is there to help you through your own mistakes and mess-ups, help you recover from shame and guilt and regret, and forgive your mistakes and give you a fresh chance to get it right. Well, that's love, isn't it? Unmerited, unconditional love. So how can you respond to that sort of love? I mean, a love that knows all that you've done wrong and that continues to love you anyway? Well, perhaps that response starts by asking yourself questions like these. What can you do for Jesus? What can you do to put Jesus first in your life? How can you begin to live and love a little more like Jesus in the way you deal with others? What can you give to honor the sacrifice that Jesus made for you? And how, especially as we're heading into Good Friday and Easter, how can you share Jesus' love with others?